Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the webinar today. We have a lot to go over. I don't want to try really hard not to go over time, so I'm going to dive right in. My name is Anissa Ryland, and I'm the director here at the Johnson Center for Child Health and Development. And today we're going to be talking about decision-making thoughts for everyone and how to make evidence-based decisions. So before I dive into the subject, I want to first tell you why I'm talking about this and who I am to do it and who I'm not. So first of all, I want to be really clear, I am not a scientist. I've worked at an organization for people with autism and their families for the past 16 years, and I'm the parent of 3 wonderfully complex children, one who does have autism and one with significant health issues. I've been a teacher, a foundation administrator, an event planner, a restaurant manager, but I've never been and will never be a scientist. And so why am I here talking to you about science? Well, that's because many of you are going to relate to this. But when I became a parent, I quickly became overwhelmed with the advice that I was given and the decisions that needed to be made. Then autism got thrown into that mix and all bets were off. Everybody and their grandmother had an opinion about what we should and should not be doing, and no 2 professionals seemed to be able to agree on what, if anything, we could or should do. It became clear that we were going to have to become a lot more savvy to be able to navigate these waters and be productive and supportive in our advocacy efforts for our children and our family. So to be clear, my strengths in school were English, history, and lunch, but when the motivation's right, I can't think of any better inspiration than your children, so you learn quickly. So I've spent the last 16 years learning how to ask discriminating questions, how to find and read research, how to try to be as objective as possible, and I've made lots of mistakes, and my hope is that today I can help you with some ideas and practical information that you can make new mistakes, and we can all be empowered to be more educated and more critical consumers. So I want to talk a little bit about why we should talk about this. We all have to make decisions, both big and small, for ourselves, for our families, and those big, small, everything in between decisions are great. We can either kind of go with that random decision-making machine, or we can come up with a path that's more effective and ultimately more comforting and confidence building. So, it's important. I'm talking about this, it's really broad. I'm going to be putting a lot of it in context and examples of childhood development and intervention and support strategies. But really, once you learn to think about this way and find these resources, you're going to see it has a really broad application to just about anything you do, both in decisions you're making for yourself or for your family. If you're a person who has autism or a related diagnosis, you can apply these strategies yourself. And it's an effective format to teach someone else how to make decisions, and so they can learn to make their own choices, which is ultimately what we all want, both for ourselves and for our kids. So when it comes to making choices, whether you're choosing between schools for your kid or deciding if you should buy organic or non-organic produce, do they need medication, should you enroll them in certain therapies, do you need a water filter in your kitchen, do you need to see a counselor, should your family give up gluten, what kind of evaluation should you do for yourself or your child, how much sleep does your child need, is fast food really bad for you? Is your anxiety normal, or are you getting into kind of a dangerous territory? Is breakfast important? Is melatonin safe? Do you need to buy special paint for your house? There's a million questions every day that we're confronted with for ourselves, for our families, that we have to answer, and it can really be overwhelming and drive you mad. But if you develop a system for making informed choices, it really can help save your sanity. You need to educate yourself, learn to knowledgeably communicate, and advocate for appropriate care or services. You're not doing this homework to make these decisions alone, but you do need to be informed so you can discuss recommendations knowledgeably, be comfortable, confident, and compliant in your decisions, and not be overwhelmed by the information overload. So first I want everyone just to kind of pause, relax, take a deep breath. Is everyone still with me? We're going to go through a lot of information. I'm going to try really hard not to talk too fast. We do post this on YouTube after the fact, so you can go back and revisit it. So really, I'd like you just to listen. You don't need to be taking notes. We'll post blogs and information about it, so we'll get all the information out there. I just want everybody to kind of listen and think about which of these things we discuss really resonates with you and is something that you can pull in as a tool in your life. If you're all with me, I want you to go over to your little panel and type in a question there, whether that's just something you're wrestling with right now or an idea you have or a way that you help make decisions. Share that with us, because we'll get that information out there. But I really want to just know you're there and we can move forward. So like I said, there is a formula. There's a logical way to make choices, and we're going to kind of go through that framework so that you can kind of go through the components and understand what it is. So every formula, we're going to start with step one. Step one is really identifying the question you're asking. You know, what is it you want to know? What are you trying to do or achieve or change or assist with? So you have to identify your question that you're asking so that you can get information. So ask questions. Questions are wonderful. Get really comfortable asking questions. We're going to move on to step two. And in step two, we're going to gather information about our question. So, you know, like I said, you want to get really comfortable with asking questions. That's a key component of being a critical consumer, no matter what you're doing, whether you're buying a car, picking a therapy, deciding on a medication or treatment course, picking a school. Ask questions. Really, that's the most important thing. And as you gather that information, you need to be really comfortable with the answer, I don't know, whether that's from yourself or from the people you're talking to. I don't know is one of my favorite phrases in my entire life, whether it's coming from me, it's one I really like to use, or it's coming from somebody I work with or somebody that I'm consulting with for myself or my kids, because it implies an honest answer, an honest exchange of knowledge. I really love it when it's followed with, but let's find out. So if you can find a clinician who will say, I don't know to you, first of all, hold on to them with two hands and never let them go. And if they don't already, teach them to follow up with, but let's find out. Let's find out who does know or where to get the information. I don't know is brilliant because it implies a humility and a willingness to learn. So you want to seek out experts. We're gathering information. You want to talk to people who know what they're talking about. Everybody specializes in something, whether your specialty is underwater basket weaving, cardiology, or anything in between. We all are experts in something. So you want to find the experts in the subject that you're trying to learn about. Find clinicians and caregivers that you trust and that you can communicate with. I'm not implying that House was that person. When you're gathering information, you also want to talk to your family and friends, maybe. And there's a caveat to that. It can have unintended consequences or backfire. But a lot of times you'll have family and friends who do have experience or knowledge about the subject you're seeking information about, and you can understand their perspective and learn information as long as you're doing so with the understanding that that's their perspective, that was their experience, not necessarily yours. Another great source to gather information from is support groups in your local community. These kinds of groups are great resources. They're also great support, and you can also find mentorship within these communities, whether they're in person or online. But you do want to be a critical mentor chooser. You know, we all have our experience and our experts about ourselves, but that doesn't necessarily make someone an expert in you or your child or your path or your question of what you're looking for. So you want to make sure you find a mentor who is aware of that, but can support you and help you in your journey. There's also great information online on websites and groups, but you do have to ask yourself where the information is coming from. It's important to be aware of and acknowledge our own biases as well as the biases of other people. It's human nature that when a finding is consistent with our own thinking, we're not as critical of the information that's being presented, and we tend to just accept it as is. The reverse of that is true as well. If there's a great study or article that demonstrates the opposite of what we believe, we're often quick to be really critical and dismiss it out of hand without an objective reason why we're doing that. So get used to playing devil's advocate, even with yourself. And this is really critically important in this day and age. We now have news sites that are tailored to a particular interest or perspective, and our social media algorithms make sure that we're presented mostly with information that we want to see, that we agree with. So we might trick ourselves into thinking that that's all there is. And you really sometimes have to get out of your comfort zone, question yourself, and go seek information elsewhere to make sure that you're fully informed. So now we've asked our questions, we've gathered some information. What are we going to do next? Well, first, you want to look at the next step. Step 3. And step 3 is where we're going to evaluate the information that we gathered. And that kind of speaks to what we were just talking about with some of those online news sources. But you want to look at what you've identified and evaluate it. What's the source of the information that's been given to you? Was it from a professional or an expert or from a layperson? What was their training or their background or their experiences? Is it your doctor or a pharmacy tech or a teacher's aide, a special educator, or a checkout clerk at the grocery store? Knowing the source of the information and then understanding their knowledge base and their experience is really critical to determining how much weight you give that information. When it comes to the experts, there are a few considerations, and one thing I want to kind of hammer home, and that is, in our example, when you have a child with health issues or special needs, the team you build or the house you build to support that child can be vast and diverse. It may include lots of family and friends, but also your pediatrician or a developmental pediatrician, your neurologist, a speech therapist, an OT, maybe a nutritionist or a dietitian, a behavior analyst, psychologist, specialty physicians like immunologists or gastroenterologists. It might include PTs or teachers, psychiatrists, geneticists, teachers. The list goes on and on. It makes a lot of people to make up a team for any child, but particularly one who might have particular health or special needs. And so you want to really think of this, because all of those people, that whole list and everybody else, everyone has a bias. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Biases are not negative. Think of it as the law of the instrument. If you know that law, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You have the tool for the job in your hand, so everything's going to look like you can fix it with that tool. If you have a professional who spent their entire career studying and working in one particular field, their perspective and their findings will fit into that experience and framework. So they still have great knowledge and expertise that's valuable for you, and as long as you recognize it comes from their experience and perspective, it's really useful. Now we're going to revisit this graphic. I found this. I used to have a different one, and I think this is a great graphic that kind of represents the types of scientific evidence, and we're going to visit this later, but I do want to talk a couple of minutes here about a couple of things on this, and we will post this as well on our social media pages. Excuse me. An anecdote is a personal story or a testimonial. It's information gained by observations and personal stories. They often start with, I know a person who, or I know a case where, I read a book that said this great thing happened. It's often the starting point in evaluating a question. Case reports are often based on anecdotal evidence, but it is important to keep it in perspective, as it may not be objective and it's not been tested or peer-reviewed, which we'll talk more about later. Anecdotal reports, like I said, they're a great place to start learning about a subject, but you can't stop there. It's really important to be somewhat skeptical of anecdotal reports, mainly for a couple of reasons. First of all, the person who's providing that report to you is likely not a scientist schooled in rigorous study design. It's very easy to make mistakes, and we've all done it. We might notice that Bobby started to really improve 2 weeks ago. At the same time, we bought him this new teddy bear and credit the teddy bear with the improvement, forgetting completely maybe that's the same time that oranges came into season and we started buying those and eating them. Or maybe there was some change at school we didn't know about, or something that was spur of the moment. Even more importantly, the person delivering that anecdotal report might be completely correct in every detail, but that applies to them. Two people really will respond the same way to a treatment, though the chances are not that high that they will. So even if it's correct, it may not be applicable. So research is the scientific search for knowledge, or the systematic investigation to look for new facts, solve new problems or existing problems, improve new ideas, or develop new theories. And that's really why that goes that step beyond those anecdotes or testimonies. And you can look through that, and we'll revisit this, but there are randomized control trials or studies. Those usually rank above the observational studies, while the opinion and editorials are ranked at the bottom. And sometimes systematic reviews are places at the most important. They're at the bottom of the page because they're reviewing several studies. So these evidence hierarchies, they're often criticized as being too focused on allowing too much emphasis to be put on randomized control trials, because not all research questions can be answered through those types of studies, either because of practical or ethical issues, or even when they're done, it's important to note that evidence from other types of studies can be relevant and just as important. If we have an in-depth case report or case study of one person or a series of people, there's information to be gathered there, and they may lead to more rigorous or larger scale studies. You might have a pilot study that's small scale, preliminary study that's conducted in order to evaluate the feasibility, the time, the cost, any adverse events or effect size. So that may inform what a larger scale study could do. There could be multiple baseline studies that involve the measurement of multiple subjects before and after treatment, or case control studies that are analytical studies that compare individuals who have a specific disease or disorder, those are the cases, with a group of people who do not have those things. So there's many kinds of studies, and then the review article is kind of different than a peer-reviewed study because they try to sum up the state of research on any particular topic. And that's kind of why they place those there at the bottom of that hierarchy. The authors search for all of the research that's related to the topic, and then they try to sort it all out. Review studies are typically cover who the important people in the field are, what the important advances or discoveries have been, areas where research might be lacking, or any controversy in that field, areas that are being looked at, areas that need more focus. But a review article, really, it's a good basic understanding of the given topic at a certain time, but they must never produce new findings of interest, as they are, by their name, reviews, reviewing past work. But we'll talk a little bit more about reviewing research studies later. I just wanted to kind of introduce that because as we're gathering and evaluating information, this is some of the information that you will come across. So next we're going to move on to step 4 in our formula of how we're going to make a decision or a choice, and that is making the choice. So we determined what our question is, we gathered the information, we evaluated the information, now it's time to choose. And you say that statement and it sounds so much easier, and I don't know about you, but I have a household full of people who really have a hard time making choices or decisions. There's so many options out there, there's so many variables, there's so much information to gather and evaluate that you can get stuck in doing that process. But at some point you do have to stop and say, based on the information I've gathered and based on the evaluation of that information to say whether it's credible or not, I'm going to make a decision now. I'm going to choose a peanut butter, if you will, unlike Calvin's dad. And I do believe that every presentation could have as much Calvin and Hobbes as possible. So we're on to step 5. We're making our choice. After we've made our choice, we need to think about how are we going to measure the success of our choice. Setting up objective tracking measures so you'll be able to make informed decisions moving forward is really important. So I love data. In the last 15 years, I have grown to truly, truly love numbers on a page. Never thought I'd say those words. But those numbers and graphs give me the confidence and knowledge to continue on the path we're headed down. I know that as a mother, as a parent, I'm financially, physically, and emotionally invested in the happiness and health of my child. So my casual observations, or even my focused deliberations, are not usually an objective measure of outcomes of any particular intervention, because I want to believe it's better, period. I'm invested in that. So I've learned to trust data rather than just my observations or my feeling of how things are going. A solid behavioral program is a great way. It's not only supported by research if you have a good one, but an effective and important treatment. But it's also an effective tool in measuring success of other interventions. If you have skilled therapists working with your child, or even a great teacher who's taking data, and you plan to introduce a new intervention, so I'm going to make one up. I want to be really clear, I'm making this up. Let's say chewing on moon rocks. We've heard chewing on moon rocks is just the latest, greatest thing to decrease aggressive outbursts. So we're going to try this. We now have an opportunity to collect objective data or measures. All you have to do is keep that teacher or those therapists who are working with your child blinded to the intervention. Don't tell them that you're mixing in the moon rocks in your child's morning breakfast cereal, and only introduce one change at a time. So don't change any other variables. That's the only change you're going to make. Then you track the data they're collecting. They're blinded, so they're not biased. They're not looking for change. They're just reporting on what they see because they don't know you've done anything. And so after, let's say, a couple weeks, their data and graphs show a decline in aggressive incidents. You can suspect that the moon rocks might be working. The real test then is if you put the moon rocks back in, or if you take the moon rocks out, and you see those incidences go back up, that might be further evidence that this is working. Introduce them again, and if the incidents decline again, you have really strong objective evidence there that it's likely working. If nothing changes at all, then that tells you something important too. And so, like I said, because those teachers or therapists are blinded, they're not looking for change, so that's more reliable data than you staring at your child intently, knowing you've done something, wondering, is that a little better? Was that a little better? What was that? You have the objective information that says, you know what, we should keep doing this intervention, or no, we shouldn't. We shouldn't invest in this anymore. So that's what I mean by setting up measurement systems. After we've done that, it's time to implement. It's time to take action. We've made our choice. We know how we're going to measure it. Now it's time to jump off the precipice and start taking action and start doing. Which brings us to the final step in our formula, and that's step 7, which is to evaluate. We've started, we're taking data. It's time to look at that data and see what is happening. Are there changes, either good or bad? If it's for ourselves, do we feel better? Is the change we're looking for happening? Are we sleeping better? Whatever it is we're trying to change, is the choice we've made helping us get where we want to get? So when you evaluate, that's going to help you make informed decisions. And because you're doing these things one at a time, you know, this thing I've invested in is working. It's bringing about the change I'm looking for, or the support I'm looking for, or the assistance I'm looking for. I'm going to keep doing it. And it's going to help you be more compliant because you have that data, you know, versus just a feeling or an idea or a maybe. And so that's why it's really good to put these steps in place. It's going to help you not only make good decisions, but help you stick to them as well. So we've gone through our formula, and now we want to say, now what? Okay, so now we kind of have this framework for how we can answer a question, how we can look at this and say, this is what we're doing and what's happening. So what are we going to do now? Well, first, you know, we're just going to pause and breathe because we're about to go in a little deeper. And I think we can talk about this quickly and go through because we have this hour together, but what we really want to do is think about how we can apply that to our life. But first, we're going to go a little deeper because I think when you're evaluating information, it's really important to have a good understanding of how to do that and kind of the things you need to be looking for. So, you know, ask yourself when you've gone through that process, do I have enough quality information? If you want to look beyond the binder that Calvin has there, you want to go a little deeper, we're going to jump back to that step 2 and gather more information. And that kind of information we're talking about is the scientific research papers. So I want to do just a quick review of how to think about scientific research and some questions to ask yourself as a layperson. Because whether it's, you know, treatment for yourself, for a family member, a friend, you kind of want to have that framework. We have this general framework for making decisions. We're going to now take that and apply it and say we want a framework for being able to understand some of the scientific research that we might be relying on to make treatment decisions. I will warn you that was my last Calvin and Hobbes. So research, as we said before, research is the scientific search for information, for knowledge, or a systematic investigation to establish new facts, solve a new problem or an existing problem, prove new ideas, develop new theories. The purpose of research or a scientific research paper is to report the results of that study and to relate those results to previous knowledge in the field, to previous studies, to previous information. So when someone says a study or a paper has been published, what does that mean? Well, publishing is the system that allows scholars to review the research studies of their peers and to be reviewed in return, and make that work available for more people to read and review. Most academic work, most scientific work is published in scientific journals. So we talked about this hierarchy before, and again I said we would share this graphic, but most studies fall into one of these categories, whether that's their animal or cell studies, case reports or series, case control studies, cohort studies, randomized trials, or a review. So most studies will fall into one of those categories in terms of what they're doing. So what does it take for someone to do a research study? There's really 4 key components needed to complete research. You need funding. Someone has to pay for the research to be conducted. Some sources of funding for research include government grants, foundation grants, corporations, or private individuals. You need knowledge. You need researchers who are knowledgeable and educated about the subject, and collaborations with other researchers and institutions to cover a greater field of knowledge. You need resources, so you need access to data. That could mean medical charts, it could be people to collect samples from, maybe one time or over time, people to collect information from, maybe through questionnaires or surveys or standardized tests, or access to existing data that's already done. So you have to have something to look at. And then you need an IRB. And an IRB stands for an Institutional Review Board. And that's a professional committee designed to review research proposals and studies. Members of an IRB are charged with protecting the rights and the welfare of the people in the research studies. These are typically university-based, but there are some private ones. And usually IRB members come from different backgrounds. Sometimes they're professionals, sometimes they're lay people, and they're appointed to serve on an IRB. IRBs are not intended to review or comment on the research design. Their focus is supposed to solely be on the rights and welfare of the research participants. It doesn't mean it always works that way, but that is the intention and how it's supposed to work. So where could you find research? Well, there's a lot of places. You can go to PubMed online or Medline and find studies there. Sometimes they're free, sometimes you have to pay for them. You can go to university sites or the individual researcher sites. Sometimes the researchers will have pages, whether they're on their institution site or organization site, where they'll post the studies they've published. Access could be granted to you there. You might find them there. Google Scholar is another place you can look to find research. I do want to note a couple of things about this. First, on all of these, sometimes articles are free. Sometimes they do charge a fee to access the full article. If you can access university or community libraries, sometimes you can find them for free there. Journal websites will sometimes post them. Or if you're being made a recommendation, if a clinician or a professional is saying, this is something I want you to do, and it's based on this research, ask for it. Have them get it for you. You can say, I'd really like to read that information myself, and get it from them. I do want to make a quick caution on research search engines like Google search or really any search engine. Pay attention to the site that you're getting information from. If you do a search for a paper title, a study title, that may take you to a blog site or something similar, and it's important to know whether or not you're reading an objective and accurate interpretation of any work. It's best to start with the actual paper, whether it's on PubMed or the researchers or university site, and then you can read other people's interpretations on blogs or other places and make informed decisions on any of those expressed opinions. And then scientific conferences, sometimes research findings are presented at conferences, for example, at MFAR, when you're talking about autism. And the conference organizers sometimes send out press releases about studies that are being presented there. This does happen at MFAR. So posters and studies presented at conferences may or may not be subject to peer review. So it's important to keep that in mind. And again, we'll talk about that in just a minute. If it is subject to peer review, the process may not be as stringent as one by a journal. So even if it's peer reviewed at a conference, that may or may not be as stringent a process as it will be to get published in a journal. Often papers or posters presented at conferences are the abstract part of the paper only, so you'd only have access to the full information that we'll outline later in this presentation as a part of that full paper. So those are just some places that you can go to find research studies. So I've mentioned peer review a couple times, and I do want to talk about that for just a second. What does peer review mean? You hear people talk about that a lot. This study is peer reviewed, or this intervention based on this study has been peer reviewed. So peer review is a process that mostly academic journals use to make sure that the studies that they publish represent good science. So when a study is submitted to a journal, the editors will send that study out to other experts in that field to get their thoughts and opinions and feedback on the quality of that work, the appropriateness that any claims are made, or things like that. This is what makes academic journals different from other publications. Newspapers, magazines, websites, blogs, all those things, they don't use peer review. They only have their editors to judge whether or not something is accurate. So peer review is essentially a quality control mechanism. Experts evaluate scholarly works, and then the objective is to try and ensure that the high quality of published science. It's important to note that reviewers do not make decisions to publish or not publish a paper, though they may make a recommendation. They don't make the final decision. That's with the editors. That decision-making rests with the editors or an editorial board. But the reviewers provide feedback that allows the editors to make the decision on whether or not to publish a study. It's common for reviewers to give conflicting feedback on the same manuscript. They may send it to two reviewers, and one may come back saying, oh, that's great for all these reasons, and another one may say, nope, didn't like it for these reasons, and then the editor either has to make a decision based on the information that's provided, or possibly send it out to another reviewer to get another opinion. So editors have a tough job. They have to take care to select reviewers who have the appropriate expertise and experience to do that job well. It's also important to note that some journals allow the reviewers to know who the article authors are, and in some journals they don't. So sometimes there is a movement and some scientists who do continue to advocate for a double-blind process, meaning neither the authors or the reviewers would know the identity of the other. And a lot of people feel like that would minimize any politics or perceived conflicts. They would be reviewing it based solely on the quality of the study presented. So there's a lot of factors that go into that, but it really is that quality control mechanism. So some people ask if scientific journals are all the same. If it's published in a journal, are we done? Quality, check, it's been done. And the answer is no. There are thousands of scientific journals that publish research articles. The topics are diverse and they can be distinguished according to their field of specialization. There's really broadly targeted and competitive journals like Cell or New England Journal of Medicine, Nature, or Science. These journals are targeted by researchers because they feel their work deserves a really broad audience. They appeal to a broad audience. But below these journals are kind of those top tier disciplinary journals, more specialized, so they tend to publish broad-based research that's focused on a particular discipline, whether that might be chemistry or geology or neurology or gastroenterology. And then next in line are the really specialized journals. So there's a journal, American Journal of Potato Research, that's specialized. So there are all kinds of different journals, and how they're differentiated really falls into two main categories. One is the journal indexed or not? And two is what is the impact factor of the journal. So an impact factor is calculated by a formula that refers to the number of times that a journal is cited or referenced in other researchers' publications. So journals with higher impact factors are deemed more important than those with lower impact factors because the work has been cited more often. Journals must be around for at least 2 years to even calculate an impact factor because this allows time for them to be referenced so that you can apply the formula so that it's out there. So the journals, an impact factor does change from time to time, but that's how it's calculated. And scientists like to try and target those higher impact factor journals when they can. So next I want to talk about a citation, because if you're going to look for research, you're going to come across citations. So a citation is the way you reference materials in your own work that comes from another source. And it also gives readers, or us, the consumers, information they need to find that source again. So let's say you're reading one study and they reference a study that sounds interesting to you. You can look at the citation and go and find it. So I just briefly want to break that down so you know how to do that. So this is an example that came from the CDC website on understanding research. So first you have the authors. So the authors who wrote the article are listed first in the citation. If there's more than one author, only the first few are listed. It might say et al. Then to indicate there were other authors on the paper. They just all didn't fit. Sometimes there are hundreds of authors. They can't list them all. Next is the title of the article. So here we have the cancer risk in women exposed in utero to this word I will not say. So that's the title of the article. And then next we have the name of the journal where the article was published. So for example, here it was published in JAMA, or the Journal of the American Medical Association. So that's where the study was published, where we would go to look for it. And then next we have the year it was published. So it was published in 1998. And then next, these numbers, this particular journal is published weekly. So the citation includes the volume number, 280, and the issue number, which is 7. And then the citations also include the page numbers in the journal, 630 to 634 of that article. So now you know what journal to go to, what year, what volume, what issue, and then what page, so that you can find it. So now you can go and find the article that you're looking for. So I want to give an example of a research article so you can kind of get a sense of the framework and how you can read it as a layperson. So we're going to use this article that was published in Pediatrics in 2011. The paper is available for download online, or was, I believe it still is. And we're going to kind of walk through it just to look at its parts and to use it as an example. So first we have the study title, and the study title summarizes what the authors were looking at in the study. So the study title of this is The Immediate Impact of Different Types of Television on Young Children's Executive Functioning. You can see it there in the highlighted section. So executive functioning is a term for the set of process that we all have to do with managing yourself and managing your resources in order to achieve a goal. So it's kind of an umbrella term for the neurologically based skill that involves attention and self-regulation. So for example, executive functioning is what lets you organize an assignment or a project. You think through the steps of how to do it and execute it and get it done. So that's what this study is about. Next, we're going to see the study authors. So they're typically listed in a particular order. There can be several authors on one paper, and as I mentioned before, anywhere from 1 to hundreds. You can read about the author's professional background once you know who they are. You know, kind of look to see, is this their field of expertise? Do they represent a particular ideological perspective? We like to think of science as objective, but most researchers now do recognize that everyone brings their values, their beliefs, and their prejudices into research. We're all humans. It doesn't mean that the values and beliefs necessarily bias their research, and that's really important to note. But the informed consumer does need to ask these questions to determine if there may be a reason to be particularly skeptical when reading a paper. And so with the authors, conventionally, the person who did the most work is listed first. Sometimes this is reversed, but this is typical. The last author is the most senior person, typically. There can be several, like I said. And like I said, be sure to note the author's affiliations and experience. So in this particular paper, the author's affiliations are actually listed on the second page, but the author's names are listed there so that you can see who did the work and look them up if you wanted. So papers often begin with an abstract. So this is just a summary that gives a brief background to the topic and describes pretty concisely the major findings of the paper and relates those findings to the field of study. So really an abstract serves two main purposes. It's going to give the readers the information they need to decide if this is the article they're looking for. Rather than having to read several pages, you can read the abstract and go, yeah, I'm on the right track. I want to read more about this. It's also used in databases to provide information for search engines and search purposes. So generally, the abstract is going to provide you with enough information to know if you want to read the whole paper, if you want to invest the time to continue to go on. So in this journal's format, the abstract is an outline of how it's laid out to the rest of the paper. So you can see there it's the abstract, has the objective, the methods, the results, and the conclusions. So next we're going to look at the study objective, or it could be called the introduction. And this section outlines the study, any necessary background information, any relevant previous studies that led to this research. Sometimes these previous studies have findings or results that are consistent with one another, and the purpose of this study might be to attempt to replicate or repeat it and help confirm those findings and provide additional information. Sometimes previous studies have not been consistent or they've had conflicting results, and the purpose of this study might be to try and figure out what was different and why they found different things and what their results would be. So in our example, in this study, our objective states that the goal of this research was to study whether a fast-paced television show immediately influenced preschool-aged children's executive functioning, or their self-regulation and working memory. So that was our objective. Next is the study materials and methods, and this section provides details about how the research was conducted, what materials were used, and how the experiments were carried out. So this is a key section to evaluate a paper. Did they look at the right population? Did they use the right tools? Did they use the right design? Does the study design fit the question and the purpose? You know, for example, if a researcher hopes to demonstrate the causal effect of a particular intervention or therapy, then an experimental design might be appropriate. But you know, if they're doing a study on the effects of a medication on the GI symptoms of a population, and they only enroll people who don't have any GI symptoms, then their findings are probably going to be negative because they didn't look at the right people, they didn't have the right subjects. So those are the kind of the questions you want to ask yourself when you're looking at that materials and methods section. So in this particular study, they have a table here that summarizes a lot of that information. The next are the study results. So this section usually describes the experiments, why they were done, and what was found. Did the data answer that original question they asked? Does the data support their hypothesis? Are the implications of their findings clear? Did the researcher discuss any study limitations that they may have had? And we can talk a little bit more about that in just a second. So in this particular study, they have their results. They also have a graph to summarize a lot of the data they collected as well. And then the next section is the study discussion. So in this section, the data is interpreted. That is, it's analyzed to show what the authors think the data shows. So any limitation to these interpretations should be acknowledged here. So if they weren't able to account for certain factors, or if they weren't able to track certain things, they need to acknowledge that. And then those findings that they do have are related to the previous knowledge and findings in the field. So this is really where the authors kind of tie it all together. So in our study paper here, in this case, the authors state that the study provided evidence that watching 9 minutes of a fast-paced cartoon, and in this study they used SpongeBob SquarePants, it immediately, and it's important to note that word, immediately impaired the preschooler's executive functioning when they compared it to children who watched a slower paced cartoon, which was Caillou, for those of you who know that, or did drawing activities. So the authors, the researchers, go on to say that they speculate this may be in part due to, and they use the word fantastical events that were presented in the faster cartoon, and they explain that when children watch the slower cartoon that's more familiar or less fantastical, in that word, they don't have to focus as hard to process that new information, and that's likely to deplete their cognitive resources or tire them out. That's a fancy way to say that. They hypothesize or question that this aspect could be partly responsible for the changes in executive functioning, and they do say that more research is needed. They then acknowledge several limitations to the study, like we talked about, and in this case they acknowledge that they don't know how long the effect lasts because they only checked it immediately. It could be permanent or it could just be temporary in a few minutes. And if you couple this with the idea they threw out that this could be fatigue, that's important to note. They also note some strengths of the study, too, including that they had random assignments, or people were randomly assigned to groups, and the range of the tests that they used were somewhat extensive that they used for that immediate follow-up. Then in the paper they go through the study references. So those are those other works that are cited. So we talked about citations. This is where any other works that they reference in the paper would be listed. So the citations that, like I said, we just talked about, they appear in this section. And we talked about how impact factor comes from other studies referencing you. This is what we're talking about. They referenced all these studies in other journals that contributes to that formula of calculating those journals' impact factor. So we just threw a lot out there. We flew through it. There's not a test, but I just wanted to give you this example so that we could highlight some questions you could ask after you've gone through a paper. So we know that not all, oh, I did skip 1 second. Sorry, there is a study acknowledgement section. That's where you acknowledge any help and maybe funding can be acknowledged there. Anyway, so we go through all of that. You know, that's exhausting if you're not used to doing it, and you might feel a little overwhelmed. But we do know that not all research is created equal. There is variability in research and variability in the practical value of research. So there are questions that you can ask yourself when you read a study or a report, now that you understand the framework and some of the terminology. So what questions does the paper address? You know, generally the introduction section is going to go from a general to a specific topic, ending with a series of questions to be asked. The results often raise more questions, so they may or may not be addressed in the paper. So you need to ask yourself, you know, what was the problem or the hypothesis that they addressed in the paper? What area were the authors focused on and why? Did they explain why this is more or less important than the others? And what background is presented? So after you've kind of looked through the study, ask yourself those questions. Then look at the conclusions. What are the main conclusions of the paper? The main conclusions are most likely going to be highlighted in the abstract, but then due to space constraints, you're going to read more in that conclusion section to get the full answer. And sometimes, and this is weird and I can't explain it, but sometimes the abstract does not accurately portray what is actually in the paper. I don't know why, but I've come across that several times, and that's why sometimes you need to read the actual conclusion rather than the abstract to make a judgment or a decision. So you want to ask yourself, does the data that they present support the conclusion that they make? You know, that's an important question. You know, what assessments did they use? What materials? Those materials can be questionnaires, checklists, observations, as well as, you know, psychological measures. It is important that the measures that they use are valid, meaning they're assessing what they're supposed to assess in a standardized and valid fashion. If there was an effect, was it big enough to make a clinically meaningful difference? So because health problems, let's say we're looking at a health problem, occur for many different reasons, including chance sometimes, researchers have to determine if an effect they're studying may have occurred in a meaningful way. A study should continue long enough to show some effect of the intervention, so it wasn't just a blip, that there was a meaningful change. But actual lengths of time can vary. Sometimes there are studies that don't go on long enough. Sometimes they do, and that's meaningful information. One example of this is a trial testing a new drug to prevent the common side effects associated with chemo. They may only need to follow the subjects for a few days, but a trial studying whether or not eating particular foods can reduce cancer risk might take years to monitor and collect data. So did they give enough time in the study for an effect to be seen? And then you want to ask, were there any attempts to explain effects as ordinary? And that's where you get into, was the effect statistically significant? And we don't have time to go into that today, but it is important that effects be statistically significant. That's how you know it's not just a blip or a random chance. And then you want to evaluate the quality. What is the quality of the evidence? Ask who were the people in the study. Did they have the right people? Like the example I gave before, did they have those people that had GI symptoms if they were looking for an effect on GI symptoms? That's a simple example, and sometimes it can be more complex, but I just want to make sure you get the idea. Do the people that they're including represent the general public? Do they need to? Why or why not? If it's a replication of earlier research, did they use the same methods of the previous studies? Because if they're trying to replicate it, they need to do it the same way. Did they have the right study size? Was it too small, or was it big enough? So, really researchers need to provide evidence that the participants in the study belong to the group under investigation. They need to include the right people. If they're replicating it, they need another study. They need to do it the same way and see if their findings are consistent. If they're not consistent, look and see, did they do it the right way? Did they do it the same way? Did they, if it's a medication, did they use the right dosage at the right intervals in the same population? How many people were in the study? Was it small? Small pilot studies really can provide interesting data for planning future larger studies, but the sample size has to be large enough to represent the larger population. So if you're reading a summary of a study, it's really important to keep in mind that 70% can be calculated as 7 out of 10 people, or 700 out of 1,000. And those are important distinctions. If I say, this medication works 70% of the time, that sounds kind of impressive. But I want to know, what does that 70% represent? How many people does that represent? And we have a few additional questions you want to ask yourself. First, was the study blinded? We talked a little bit about keeping teachers or therapists blinded when you're kind of doing your own mini studies, but when a study is blinded, that really just means that the people involved are prevented from knowing some of the information that might lead to conscious or subconscious bias on their part. So if I'm testing a new drug and we manufacture a regular pill and a placebo, or a fake pill that looks like a real one, and the person taking it and the person evaluating them doesn't know which one they get, then they're blinded. If I know that they're getting the intervention pill, that might somehow alter or influence my assessment. So we like to see those blinded. In a randomized study, subjects are assigned to different groups randomly, essentially like tossing a coin. So there's not any bias through the assignment or allocation process. And then what conflicts of interest are reported? So conflicts of interest are declared by authors when the author or researcher may be in a position to benefit from the results of the research. So for example, if a researcher is being paid to conduct a study by a company, and if that or other studies they're working on might benefit that company based on the outcome of the study, that could be a conflict of interest because they are banking on an outcome. Disclosing those potential conflicts of interest does not mean the author's done anything wrong, but it's just something for you to weigh in and consider when evaluating that evidence. And it is important to note that there are issues that unfortunately are almost impossible for those of us without a PhD to pick up on. In fact, some MDs may not pick up on them. Not only can study group sizes be smaller than optimal, or study authors might have other constraints that affect their outcome, like limited cell lines or access to cell lines, they might make assumptions based on limitations that are hard for us to see. Ideally, higher-powered journals are more selective about details that can be really quite important. And this is really where having a relationship with a trusted clinician or expert can help you make sense of what you're learning. So as we're going through this, I don't want to discount making sure you have that voice to help you interpret those things. So in the example we used in our study here, where we had SpongeBob versus Caillou versus drawing, they told us, the authors in their study gave us these considerations. We asked these questions, and so we can come up with a brief analysis. SpongeBob is recommended for older kids. If you look at the creators, they recommend it for kids 6 and up. Caillou is meant for preschoolers ages 3 to 5. So that was the age group that was used in the study, was 3 to 5. So SpongeBob was already too old for them for the creators' guidance. They only showed incomplete episodes to the participants. So some of the critics of the study argue that showing an incomplete episode can lead to the disruption. One compared it to hearing a piece of music that never resolves. So if you only get to see a little piece and you don't know what happens, does that increase your heightened sense of attentiveness or fatigue. And then it's also noted that the immediate effect was shown. Remember, I said remember that word immediate. The authors acknowledged that it's unknown if that effect caused anything more than a momentary issue. Was it just a fleeting depletion of attention or executive functioning skills and then they bounced back and were normal, or were there long-lasting effects? This study did not answer that question because they only looked right after. And then one psychiatrist had a review in Parenting Magazine of the study, and his quote was, "I perceive this study to be preliminary. It used a small sample that was not representative of the population. It could have profited from more extensive baseline assessments of the kids, and it was not reported how many kids, might not be all of them, and the SpongeBob condition group had lower executive functioning performance." This doesn't mean that the study was badly done, but it means it needs to be replicated with a more powerful design and more assessments before we start making evidence-based recommendations on the results. So that was the interpretation. The study did not say that SpongeBob was bad. I'm not sharing my personal opinion, but kind of annoys me. But the study essentially just called for more research, and it cautioned that when letting younger children watch shows that are faster paced and recommended for older children, it might be something to consider. It was not an indictment of SpongeBob, it wasn't a recommendation for Caillou, and it did not speak to the content of either one of those. Essentially, the conclusion most could draw is to exercise the same common sense and judgment that people have been advocating. So, this example, it actually makes me think of a study that came out that noted that autism was more common in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, and it led some people to the conclusion, and some media outlets reported the conclusion, that there were fewer sunny days there, so kids were probably watching more TV, therefore watching TV caused autism. That was kind of the correlation that was drawn. And that was a message that was delivered in the media, and we still sometimes do hear that repeated. So, I jokingly proposed my own take on that. I have a lot of friends and family in the Pacific Northwest. Most of them are huge Seattle Seahawks football fans, and they don't ever miss a game. So I believe that being a Seahawks fan causes autism. And so, full disclosure there, I'm a big Saints fan, even still. But clearly, I'm kidding, I'm teasing, but you see the logical missteps that can take place in situations like this. You may have heard the term correlation does not equal causation, and that would apply here. It's important to be aware that correlation does not equal cause and effect, and that's why we need effective research studies. So let's talk about with our example, if we're reading about this study that came out in 2011, and we're talking about SpongeBob and Caillou and drying and attention, first we want to ask ourselves, what's the source of the information we're reading? I'm going to come back to that message. Is this someone's opinion? Are they testimonials or anecdotes, marketing materials for Caillou, reference materials, published research, or are we reading it in a media report? Because quite often that's where we're getting information. We often rely on the media to inform us of the latest research results. And often this information is given to us in short articles or sound bites or news clips. Because most of us aren't scientists, we often believe what's written in papers or magazines or news sites without really questioning some basic assumptions about that article. So as critical consumers that we're all striving to be, we really need to be a healthy amount of skeptical when we read news interpretations of any research findings. So when we're talking about science in the media, and honestly this is a big enough topic for a whole other webinar, I think John Oliver recently did a show about it, but we're going to go into it really briefly here. If you see a report in a newspaper, on the news, or online that's talking about a research study, the first thing you should ask yourself is, what are they basing this story on? Is it based on a publication or press release from the study authors? Do they refer to the actual publication itself, or or was it just the press release by the authors of the supporting institution? Who are their sources? Are they experts in that field? Do they have any conflicts of interest? What did the actual study say? Not the reporter's interpretation of the study, but the actual interpretation. If there's data presented in the news story, do they reference where the data comes from? And so, it's important to ask these questions anytime you're reading about science in the news. Because, I'm going to show you with our study example, the one we've been talking about that concluded that there was that immediate effect on executive functioning skill after watching 9 minutes of SpongeBob. It's the same one we just went over, that the author said that the result may really just be having to focus so much because it's faster paced and it might fatigue the person, that they acknowledged they didn't know if it had any lasting effect. Well, that study was picked up by a lot of news sources at the time, and reported on. And here were some of the headlines. Study says SpongeBob makes kids stupid. That's not what the study said. Watching it leads to learning problems. It actually didn't have anything to do with learning. At least they talk here about their ability to concentrate. It didn't really say that it overtaxed your brains. We go through this, SpongeBob is bad for your brain. And I'm not presenting this as an advocate of SpongeBob, not a big fan, but I'm a big advocate of understanding accurately what science says. And if I just read these news stories on some very reputable news sites, I might think, wow, SpongeBob makes you stupid and unable to learn and focus and all these things. And we don't know if that's true. So it's really important to go to the article and know that some of these headlines were not accurate. So we've gone over a lot. I'm trying to stay within our time because I know a lot of you have lunch. So really quickly, I just want to talk about what else you can do. We need research in all aspects of life, whether we're talking about autism or children's health or learning or cancer or any number of things. We need research to continue vigorously to solve the problems in the world. And researchers really have two big hurdles. One is money, something most of us can't help with. If you can, please donate to research. But if you can't, the other pressing hurdle is participants. It's really, really hard to get people to take the time or make the effort to participate in research. But it is necessary. We all need it. It's how we're going to find answers that will help us and help our kids and kids being diagnosed with things in the future. So you can find studies and participate in many places. Clinicaltrials.gov is a great site which will tell you studies in your area. You can look at your local universities. For example, here in Austin at the University of Texas, they have an education center, a child study center that's often doing research, and then they also have individual schools that may be doing different science-based research or education-based research. Look at community groups. Sometimes they're doing research that might be more advocacy-based or community voice-based. Look at private institutions, whether they're nonprofits or even corporations sometimes are doing research. But get involved, become a participant. Even, controls are really important. Often researchers need people who don't have the disease or disorder that they're researching for that compare group to do a really good quality study. So get involved whenever you can. And it's not entirely selfless. It's actually not selfless at all, because ultimately the information will help you in your community, but it also can sometimes give you access to free care or interventions or data. It can also sometimes pay you. Sometimes you'll receive compensation for participating in research. So get involved. Look for flyers like this. This is one from one of our studies where you can get involved, particularly with children. It's very hard to find pediatric participants, so it's really important to try and get people involved. I know we've flown through a lot. Like I said, we will post this on our YouTube channel. If you'll follow us on Facebook or Twitter, we often post information like this on webinars and blogs. And I really want everyone to give themselves a high five. We've slogged through a lot of information today, and I hope that you found something that's helpful. I hope that as you think about it, if you have ideas and suggestions for other things people can do, you'll send those to us so that we can share them with our community and continue to educate people on how to be critical consumers. That's something that I think serves us all as parents, as people taking care of ourselves, and as community members. So if you have any questions or suggestions, please feel free to email us. And if you are looking for a certificate of attendance, you'll receive an email in 1 hour that will have a link to a short quiz you may take, that once you successfully complete that, you can download the certificate. Thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you for joining us.